All right, we're going to start by provisioning the resources we're going to need, just so that that's taken care of. So we're going to start with creating a web application for all three of the components, the authentication service itself, the API, and the web front end. So I'll create a new resource group, and then we will create a new authentication service. We'll start with that one. Oops. We want to run this on .NET 2.2, and we're going to run this on Linux. And we're going to host an EastUS2. We don't need a premium plan. We can get by with just the basic plan. So we will choose basic 1. And that should be it. We will create this. Okay, great. And so that's going to take a minute to provision. So while that's happening, let's go ahead and create the application that is going to actually serve as the authenticating application. So we're going to come in and we're going to do new registration. This is under app registrations. And we will create this as auth service. We're going to specify the URL that it's going to return the authorization code to. And that's going to be, in my case, auth2.plosnay.com because I already have a auth.plosnay.com service. So that's API auth token. So there's my URL. I'm going to register that. And then I am also going to go back in here under authentication again, and we're going to go ahead and add the endpoint that eventually we're going to use for localhost debugging. So I'm just going to do that on localhost port 5100, and then the rest of the URL is the same. That's an HTTP because I'm not going to use certificates running locally. And before I save this, I also need an implicit grant only for ID tokens. You definitely do not want to use implicit grant for access tokens. That's no longer a secure flow. But we do want to select ID tokens so that we get an ID token from the OpenID Connect endpoint. And I can go ahead and save that now. And then if I were creating this as a authentication service that's only going to authenticate this one application, then I could go ahead and define some roles. If this is going to be a centralized authentication service that's going to support multiple applications, I wouldn't do this. And so that's what I'm going to show is I'm going to pretend that this is an application that's, or this is a centralized authentication service that's going to support multiple applications. So I'm going to leave that alone for now. And there's really nothing else I need to do with this. But before I leave this, let me go ahead and create the application. This will just be a fake application, and I just want to get the user roles for this, and we'll pretend that this is one of the applications that the centralized authentication service is going to work for. So we'll just call this my app. And I don't even need a redirection URI or anything because I'm literally not going to use this for anything other than getting the permissions to it. So in here, I will go ahead and add some roles for this application though. So create the application roles. All right, so we're going to add a user role and an administrator role. And so this goes under this app roles section. I can call these whatever I want, but in this case, the display name for this one is going to be user. And the description is users can use the app. And it will return a value of user. And then I'll create another one called admin. And we'll say admins can manage the app. And it will return a value of admin. And of course, these two GUIDs here are not legitimate. So I am going to generate a couple of new random GUIDs. Okay, these will work fine. So we'll copy this first one, put that in here, and we'll copy the second one and put that in here. Okay, so now I have a couple of roles for my application, and I'll use that a little bit later. But this basically the first application that I created is going to be used for the authentication app. It's what everything's going to run under in order to sign in the user and that sort of thing. But then one or more of these apps that I'm creating here, it will provide authentication for, and so those are the ones that actually have roles associated with them. So let's do one other thing. Our app service did finish getting provisioned, so we can see that up here. So let's go ahead and create our other two application services. So our other two web apps that will go in our app service. So I'm going to select my same resource group. This one I'm going to call WFE. This will be my front end. My web front end is actually running under Node. So we'll just choose 1014, and we're going to choose the same region. And by choosing the same region, it'll automatically go ahead and pull up our Linux plan that we already have, and that's good. That's the one I want. And that will start creating. And because we already have the app service plan, I can go ahead and create my other web app for this one as well. And so I will come in here and I will choose this, and we will create this one as API. And the API is also running .NET Core 2.2. Again, we're going to choose Linux. We're going to choose East US 2. We're going to choose the same app service plan. These don't have to be deployed on the same service or in anything, in any of the, basically in any way, shape, or form. I mean, they could be on completely different types of infrastructure. They could be in completely different app service plans. They could be given completely different subscriptions. It really doesn't matter. And so those services are creating. So we'll leave those and move on to the next part while those are getting created. All right, so my services are now all created. If we go and we take a look at the resource group that we have, we've got an app service for our API, our auth, and our web front end. So let's go ahead and do, the real reason why I wanted to provision this first was because there's one part of this process that can take an hour or so to propagate, which is assigning the managed identity access to the Microsoft Graph, so that we can query for those user roles that we just created. So if I come in here to the authentication app service, I can enable managed identity. And managed identity is just, it's a service principal that this application is going to run under. So in this case, the authentication service is now going to run under this application identity right here. So one of the things that we need to give that the ability to do is to read the directory information from the Microsoft Graph. This is going to require administrative consent, but what this is going to allow us to do is to use let the authentication service query for objects in the graph, and so it will query in the graph to find out what roles these various applications have, what roles the users have in the various applications. So this is going to require PowerShell, so we're going to pop open a Cloud Shell right here. And there's an article, this is linked to in the documentation, so you can see the URL there. But this is going to walk us through the process of creating this, or assigning this application right. Now, I will go ahead and warn that this does throw an error. And while I've raised that as an issue, it appears to be a known problem right now. and it will still work. It'll just take a while to propagate. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get the service principal by just getting the service principal with this particular object ID. And if we want to check and make sure that actually worked, we can press this in and we can see, yes, in fact, we actually did get our auth service. So that's all good. Then we can get the graph service principal. This is just literally the service principal ID for the Microsoft Graph service. So this is always the same. I can just copy and paste this. Okay, there, great. Got that object. Then I want to get out of that object the specific role for directory read all. And so I'll do that. And again, we can check and make sure we actually got it. And we did. There's the directory read all application, right? And so now we take all this together. Oh, and actually, before I run this new role assignment, we can actually run this get role assignment to see if this right is already provided to us. And in fact, what we see is that it is not. It didn't format very well, but it didn't return any objects. So that's good because now we're going to run this new app role assignment, and that will assign the role, but it's going to throw an error. And the only way that we're going to know that it actually worked is to check, and then we will see. Okay, so here we did get an error saying we don't have the rights to do it. Turns out that's not true. So if we do run the get again, we can now see that we do, in fact, get that right. It has been assigned. Now, it will take, like I said, maybe an hour to propagate, but it should work. It's just, for whatever reason, documented that it throws errors, but it should work. So that's all we really need to do there. Now, it's only the authentication service that actually needs that right, so that's all good. The other thing that we need to go ahead and do, though, is we can go ahead and create the app configuration, which will store all of their configuration for these services. And I'll just call this secrets, or I'm sorry, this is our config, so we'll call this config. And we'll store it in the same application group. And I don't have East US2 as an option for the application configuration, so I'll just go East US. That's as close as we can get it. All right, so that's going to deploy. And then while that's deploying, we can also go ahead and add the key vault. So we're going to put that in the same resource group. We're going to, we'll just call it secrets. We will store this in East US2. Standard is fine. The access policy for right now is fine, although one of the things that we're going to do is change that in just a minute. And really, there's nothing else we need to do here, so we can go ahead and create this. And it looks like our app configuration already got created. So while this is creating, we can go ahead and fix our application configuration service. So I already showed that the authentication service, I already got its identity and created that as a managed identity. I need to do that same thing for the API service, because both the API service and the authentication service are both going to read their configuration from the app config. And so they'll both need managed identities to do that. So we will create a managed identity for this one as well. And it looks like my key vault's done. Okay, so now I've got managed identity for both my authentication service and my API. And now what I can do is I can go to that app configuration and I can add a role. So access control over here. I'm going to add a role assignment for those two managed identities that I just created. So if I search for, oops, I'm sorry, this is the role. So I'm going to have to give these owner rights because, so the way app configuration authenticates, it doesn't actually use the ARM authentication. It instead uses specific access keys And so we can use our managed identity to get the access keys and then create the authentication that we need. But in order to do that, we need to be an owner in order to fetch those keys. So in this case, we're going to choose our application that we created, plosna auth, or sorry, not the application, but the managed identity that we created, plosna auth. And we can save that. And then we can also add another role assignment for the API. So there it is. And again, we'll give it owner. And we're not actually going to store any secret information in the configuration service. It is literally just going to be configuration. And then anything that is a secret, we're going to store in the key vault, and we're just going to instead store a URL in the configuration that points to that secret in the key vault. And so now if we go to the key vault, we also need to give those two applications that we created access rights to read those secrets from the key vault. So the only right we actually need is secret get. And again, we can select a principal, and I can do plosna auth for this one again, and we'll find our actual application. And that's everything we need there. And then I can also add my API. Actually, I don't actually need my, so I was going to add my API, but there's actually nothing in my API that actually requires any secrets. So we don't need to add that one actually. It's the only secrets are going to be actually accessed by our authentication service. So we're good to just do that one. And that's pretty much it. So now both of those applications, so the authentication service has access to both the configuration store and the key vault, and it has access to the Microsoft Graph, or it will as soon as that propagates. And the API service just has the ability to read the configuration from our configuration service. So we should be good with all that. And so we can now move on to the next part. All right, the next thing we should probably do is go ahead and configure our domain. So if I pull up my GoDaddy domain for plosna.com, I can go ahead and add the CNAME records for my three components. So I have a WFE2 that's going to point to plosna-wfe.azurewebsites.net. And I'll have a CNAME record for API2 that's going to point to plosna API-azurewebsites.net. And finally, I will have a CNAME record for my auth2 that's going to point to plosna-auth.azurewebsites.net. Okay, so there's the three domains in GoDaddy. That might take a minute or so to run through, so I'm not going to go out here and configure my sites just yet. But I'm going to go ahead and clone my Git repository. So this is the OpenID Connect repository here, so that I have a working copy locally that I can use to debug and to then also push up to the servers. So I'm going to do a git clone, and I'm going to give this a new name. All right, I've cloned that repo. I'm also going to remove my Git directory in here so that I'm not pushing these changes back up into my live Git repo here. Okay, so that's perfect. Okay, so now if I go into the tools directory in here, I can do a .NET run config-wizard. This is going to take a minute the first time to pull down the dependency libraries from NuGet, but as soon as it does that, it should run my configuration wizard. Okay, great. And so I need to provide an identifier for my application. So we call this sample. I need a base domain. That's going to be plosne.com. That's the domain that all three of my subdomains are based off of. And then my subdomain for WFE is going to be WFE2. Subdomain for auth is auth2. The API is API2. The GUID of my Azure tenant that provides the authorization app. So if I come back over into the Azure portal and I go to Azure Active Directory and I go to my app registration and go to my authentication service, there's a directory tenant ID up here. That's the ID I need for this. So I'm going to copy that, paste that in. And then my application ID, or also called client ID of the authorization app. So that's the number right above it. So that's good. I'll paste that in there. How long do I want to sign the token for? We'll just do 60 minutes, which is an hour. How long, or excuse me, what is the name of my Azure Key Vault? So I called that plosne-secrets. We can double check that, of course. If you look over here, yep, plosne-secrets is what I called my Key Vault. Secrets. Do I want a lot of tokens to be reissued? We'll say yes. For local debugging, what port do I want to host on? We'll go with 5000. What port do I want to host my authentication service on? 5100. And which one do I want to host my API service? We'll go with 5200. For local debugging, do I want to allow a more permissive environment? So I'll allow the tokens in the headers instead of just being in the cookie, or verify the XSRF header being off. I'm going to go ahead and say yes. That'll make things a little bit easier to debug. Okay, and now I've got a full configuration for my environment. So what that did, by using the wizard, of course, we could just copy the sample file that's in the sample configs and modify it. But using the wizard should ensure that all the paths and the names and everything are set up correctly. So it's generally a good idea to use that. Now we can import that into our configuration here. So I'll go to Configuration Explorer in my app configuration. Oops, excuse me, actually I need to go to the import and export section over here at the side. So I'll import a configuration file, choose .NET, it's a JSON file, and my file. So in that directory that I ran the wizard from, it will have created a configuration JSON file right here. Yep, that's the right one. And we will apply it. Okay, so it says 31 keys were imported. If I go to my Configuration Explorer, I can now see that indeed my configuration did get fully imported into here. So that's good. So that should have me all good to go. So let's go ahead. Now we should have the stuff propagated from the GoDaddy domains. So let's go ahead and try and configure each of these domain services real quick. So if I go under my API service, I'm going to have to do this to all of them, but we'll start here. And then go to custom domains. I can add a custom domain in here, api2.plosne.com. We can validate that. And it should just take a minute, but that will basically query our DNS server and see whether I've actually put the name plosne-api-azurewebsites.net as a CNAME record for api2.plosne.com. And hopefully this does not take too much longer. Okay, good. So we can add that custom domain name in here. And let's go ahead and add all the names, and then we'll add the certificates. So if I come in here under custom domain for the auth, we can add auth2.plosnode.com, and we can validate that one. Again, it's going to go through the same check here. Okay, good. And that's added. And now let's go to our web front end. Again, we can add a custom domain. This is going to be wfe2.plosnode.com. Validate that. Oh, found it immediately, so we're good there. We'll add, and it's all good. So now let's go through each one of those and add the SSL certificate. I already have an SSL certificate that I got from my certificate authority. So we'll add this back in. We'll upload the certificate. Let's see, this is under certs, and it's a star certificate. So the same certificate will work for all three of my subdomains. Okay, good. And I can choose. And we'll add that binding. Okay. I have noticed sometimes when you come in here and you try and add the certificate, like after adding the custom domain, that it takes a few minutes to show up. It's kind of why I did it in the order of adding all of the domain names and then going back and adding the certificate. So for whatever reason it doesn't work, try it like 2 or 3 minutes later and it should be fine. Okay, and finally the WFE. This is just going to prepare us for later when we run this. Actually on the server. But the first thing we're going to do is run in debug mode locally. I just wanted to go ahead and get this already set up so we were configured when we did push to the servers. Okay, looks pretty good. So we now have the domain names registered, we have the configuration created and imported, and we have each of the domains with a certificate and a custom domain name. Okay, so the one actual configuration item we haven't done is to put any actual secrets into our key vault. So you'll notice if we come here and look at the secrets, we haven't actually put anything in. So let's go ahead and clone this repository, because now we're going to start modifying the configuration of this. And I don't want to mess up my good copy, so I will just clone this. And then inside the clone, I will make a directory called certs. And then we can create our certs there. So if I go to the implementation guide, I do have all the commands for doing this. So we're going to create a private key and then a certificate based off of that. We have to provide a password and a country code. Nothing else really matters. So now I've got my certificate and my private key. I need this in a PFX format. So I'm going to run another command to convert that into a PFX, the private key and the, okay, so now I've got my cert PFX, which is all that packed into a PFX. And then I can get, I'm going to need my PFX as a base 64 object, so I can put this in as a secret. So I can run that command and get this out here. And now I can create this secret in here. And in my configuration, I called this private key. Oops, private key, all one word. And I will paste that secret in, or paste in the base 64 encoding that I made. And then I also have to put in the password that I used for that. So I create that as private key PW. Technically, these the names that I'm putting in here you can change, but these are the names that get generated by the configuration wizard, so just easier to keep those the same. And then I can create my public cert 0, which so the I can have up to 4 public certs because I might be doing key rotation and need to validate off of multiple keys, even though I'm only signing with a single key. So I have a single private key always, but I can have a public cert 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 if I need them. Right now, I've only got one. So the certificate PIM file is already base64 encoded. So we're just going to grab that and drop it in, including the begin and end certificate sections. Okay, so those are the keys that I needed in here. There was one other key that was generated as part of our configuration that was command password. I believe it's just command PW. We can check our configuration just to make sure. Command password, it's this one here. So let's see. Yep, command PW. So I'm going to go ahead and create that one as well while I'm out here. There's nothing in these videos that's actually going to use the command password, but like clearing cache requires it. So just in case you ever needed to do that. Okay, so now I've got my keys all created out here and uploaded and everything. So that all should be good. So now let's go ahead and try and bring up a local debug environment. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a few windows because I'm going to do this for all 3 of my parts of my application. So I'm going to create a window for my authentication service, for my API service, and for my web front end. All right, so I've already cloned my repo, so I'm going to go into the clone repo, and we'll make this top service the authentication service, and we'll make this bottom one the API service, or the middle one, excuse me, and this bottom one will be the web front end. Okay. All right, and in the sample configs, I already have some local environment variable settings. So what we need to do is we need to say what port we want to host these on, and then we need to say how to get to our configuration. Because as you saw, there's 30 some configuration settings that need to be set, but we need a few things already set in there to know how to get to the configuration. So I thankfully already have, if you look in the sample config, a local environment file for each of these. And so if I copy that, like say the auth local env, and just name it .env in my auth directory, and then if I show that file there, what's inside here is the host URL that we're going to host it on. So in this case, port 5100, which matches what we have for our configuration. We're going to turn the log level to debug. We're going to say which application resource ID to connect to. Now that, of course, is wrong. I'll need to actually specify a legitimate configuration. So we'll have to change that. And then I've got my configuration keys. My configuration keys that I'm going to load for this, it works from left to right. So sample auth local basically means load the authentication local keys. If you find it there, great, stop. Otherwise, look for the common local configuration settings. If what you're looking for isn't there, then stop, and then come over here to the sample auth dev and look for it there, and then the common dev. So we're basically getting more generic as time goes on, and hopefully we find the key we're looking for. This allows us to not have to override all the keys for local. We only override the things we actually need to override. Okay, but as I mentioned, the resource ID is wrong. And I'm going to go ahead and copy these other files, and we'll just change all of those resource IDs at the same time because because why not? There's no reason to copy it more than once. So here I'm going to take the API locally env, and then if we look at what it's got the same thing except it's hosted on port 5200, and of course the configuration keys are different. And for the WFE, this one's going to be a bit different because we didn't give our web front end access to the to go to the Azure app configuration, and we don't want to. We want to actually have it pull configuration from our API. So in our there's a configuration setting called present config, and you specify which configs to present. And so that's what this is actually going to use, is one of those presented configs. So if we look in here, it's going to host on 5200, and then it's going to, it's going to host on 5000, and then it's going to go to 5200, which is our API, and it's going to read this API config WFE configuration. Okay, so that's all that. To get the correct app config resource ID, I just need to go to my app config, and I go to properties, and there's a resource ID right here, so I can copy that. And then probably the easiest thing for me to do is just to open up VS Code and go to my authentication service, my .env file, and I'll just override that value. And my API service, same thing. I'll overwrite that value, and we'll just save everything. And so now if we look at our .env file, of course, it's got the correct configuration in it. So that's pretty much what I need to do in order to run this. This all should be good, except for one very important thing. So when I'm running locally, I need to be able to get access to the app configuration. I need to be able to get access to the key vault, all those things. Now, when I'm running on the server, it's doing all that through the managed identity. When I'm running that locally, though, it needs to run under my current credentials in order to get that, which means I need to do an AZ login and log in to the correct environment that I want to use so that the credentials that I want to use for my local account to be able to get access to those resources will work. So I'm going to do an AZ login. And that should open a browser window. Yep, there we go. And I just need to make sure I'm logging in on the correct account. So this is the account that actually has access to the resources, the key vault and the app config. And we'll wait for a second. Okay, so now I've got access to that particular environment. So now when I start this up, I should be able to get to it. If you start these up and you get a 401 error, it's probably that. It's probably that whatever account you use to sign in on AZ login doesn't have access to the individual resources that you need to get access to. So we're going to do a .NET run up here, a .NET run here. That's going to take a few minutes to spin up because it's going to have to read the dependencies from NuGet and compile everything. And then our web front end is actually a Node application. So we're just going to do an npm install. And then we can do a node and the file is index. So that'll go ahead and start. So we're listing on 5,000 right there. Okay, so actually you can see right here, went by too quick, but it did actually show that it was using AZ CLI to get the credentials. And so that's fantastic. And actually one other thing I'll point out here, let's scroll the way back up. So you can see here it says managed identity with failback to AZCLI. And then each of my configuration values that it read for this environment got populated in here. So I can actually see what my config ended up looking like once all those config keys were rendered. So now I should just be able to pop open a browser and test this. So I'm going to go to localhost 5000. And just in case something doesn't work, I'm going to go ahead and open up my debug window down here. And I'm going to run through a login. Now I do need to make sure I log in with an account that actually has access to this particular domain, and this is my Peter Losnay directory that I actually created all this in. So I'm going to use just a user account in that system. Okay, so it completed the login successfully. And now if I pull the details about me, that does show up correctly under there. And I won't go through all the other information in here. You can read all that in the system, but they're in the documentation rather. But it does go through what all the replies should contain for all the different services and everything. So you can see, but for right now it's all working, so we're all good there. So now let's talk about posting this to the actual production services that we created. So I'll stop this running locally. So one thing I noticed is we didn't actually have any application roles show up for the applications. And then it occurred to me, well, at the beginning, we created the application that we wanted to get authentication for, and we created the roles. We never actually set the user up for any roles. And I think I was just waiting for it to propagate, but we can do that now. So if I go to Azure Active Directory and go to Enterprise Applications, and we go to plazne My App, this is the app we're wanting to get the roles for, not the authentication app. And then I go under users and groups. I can add just my regular old user account, and I can give it a role. And the two roles that we defined earlier were admin and user. I'm going to go ahead and assign it to both just so that we see what it looks like when a person has more than one role. But, obviously assign is appropriate. No roles, lots of roles, only one role, doesn't matter. Okay, so oops, I assigned the user role twice, so let's try this again. We'll assign the admin role now. Okay, so now I'm both a user and an administrator with this user account. There's one more thing we need to do. So if I go out here and go back to my app registrations and go to plazne My App and grab my application ID for this application, what we need to do is we need to tell the authentication service which applications we want to get roles for. And so if I go back out to my configuration, and go to Configuration Explorer, I can create a configuration node called sample:dev, or excuse me, sample:auth:dev:application ID, application underscore ID, and then specify a comma delimited list of all the application IDs that I want to get roles for. Now, I only have one right now, so I'm just going to put that in, but if I had more, I would just do comma and all the other ones. And when I apply that, and we can look at my values now, I've now got this sample auth dev application ID and the value. So now when we get around to running this on the actual server, we should then see we have some roles for that application. All right, we need to add those couple of application settings to each one of these applications, much like we did in the .env file. So I'm going to go here to plazne API and go to configuration and add an application setting. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at my env file, and I'm going to copy the app configuration resource ID because that's one of the two settings we need. So there it is. That's great. That's going to tell us where to get the configuration from. And then the other thing that, of course, I need to know which keys to pull. And actually, this is the API service. So if I look at the configuration for the API, I have here all the keys that I want to pull. However, you'll notice that a couple of these are for the local environment. I don't need those. So all I really need is the API, sample API dev and sample common dev. So those are my two configuration key settings and my resource, my app config resource ID. So I'll save that. Okay, and then we'll do the auth service. And again, we'll copy the app resource, app config resource ID. And config keys. And we'll just copy the two we need. Okay, and that's all good. So that'll give us the configuration for both our API and our authentication service. For the web front end, much like what we saw for the ENV, it doesn't actually get its configuration from those services. So if we look at this one, what we do need though is this config URL, which is the URL where it gets configuration from. And that will not be localhost. We will change this to be api2.plosne.com, API config WFE. So that is the endpoint that gives us our config. And we're good there. So we save that. So now we've got all the configuration that we need for these. So now let's deploy. If we go to the deployment center, we'll just start with the WFE. We can deploy via Git. Okay, we got a Git URL. And so here for our WFE, we'll do a git init, we'll do a git add, we'll do a git commit, and we'll call this v1. And we will do a git remote add, we'll call it Azure, and we'll paste in the URL for our git endpoint. And then we'll do a git push set upstream Azure master. And I'm going to have to do a force because I actually tested pushing some of these before, and so I need to override what I actually have deployed out there. So what we should see is we've got a pending installation now for WFE. So now let's go and look at our auth service. And we will go to Deployment Center, local git, and we will deploy this. If we look, our bottom one's already actually deployed successfully, so that's great. So for was this our API or our auth? This was the actual auth service, so that's actually up here. I will do a git init, git add, git commit, a git remote add Azure, the endpoint, get a git push set upstream Azure master, and again I'll do a dash force just to force it to deploy over top of what I already have out there. Okay, good. All right, so that's running, and we will finally do our API service. So again, we'll go to deployment config, local git. Okay, and I'll copy that URL again. And we will do a git init, git add, git commit. Oops, spelled it wrong. A git remote add Azure, and then our URL. And a git push set upstream Azure master, and we'll do a dash force. Okay, and it looks like our auth service was successful. So now we'll push the API service. And again, I'm showing this with Azure App Services, but anything can work. These could be containers. These could be deployed on AKS. These could be deployed on a VM. It doesn't really matter. Um, Anything will work. So as soon as this is successful, okay, great. That is successful. Okay, the only thing left to do is to test it. So we'll open up a new private browsing window and we'll go to https wfe2.plosne.com. And if it takes a minute to come up, don't really worry about it. It'll take a while anytime the applications are restarted for the or anytime the app service is restarted for it to warm back up and compile the code. So we'll go through the authentication process or go through the login process rather. So we specify the user we want to log in as. It goes through the process. Okay, perfect. And now I will hit me to see who I'm authenticated as, and that's great. So now not only do I have my user and my OID, I do also have the application ID that we specified and the roles that I have within that application, which is the user and the admin role. So everything is working perfectly. Thanks for watching the video.